So this is my chapter 6 segment 4 outline. It started with sexual selection may have contributed to hominin brain expansion. This started with Geoffrey F. Miller, who suggested that natural selection to obtain food and shelter is probably not the reason for large brains and complex intelligence in humans. One of the examples was that it was only after the brain stopped growing for quite a long time that technological progress developed. So, in the end, brain didn't really correlate well with the benefits of enlarged brains. Miller also proposed an additional account for large brains that was sexual selection, saying that creativity in enlarged brains aid in the ability to attract attention, stimulate, and surprise potential mates. This also allows for human traits like humor, art, music, language, and creativity. His hypothesis was that sexual selectivity for artistry and creativity may lead to an increase in brain size. He gave an example of the bowerbirds, which use dances and songs in order to attract mates, and based on what the female likes better, that's the mate she'll choose. The next is primate species differ in gene expression. Humans and chimps have about 99% of the genomic DNA sequences identical to each other, but in many ways we differ morphologically, behaviorally, and cognitively. So that difference is accounted for about two reasons. The first is that DNA sequence of specific genes may vary in important ways between species. And the second is that humans and their non-human relatives differ in how those genes are expressed to construct a complex protein. Examples of this are that the gene ASMP influences the size of the cerebral cortex. In humans and chimps, those proteins are encoded very differently. Gene expression between us and chimps are so different that they actually are more cognitively related to monkeys, and this is probably due to selection pressures from our hominin descendants. So we move on to box 6.3, which is evolutionary psychology. Evolutionary psychology is a field devoted to asking how natural selection has shaped behaviors in human. Evolutionary psychologists believe that the mind is a large collection of cognitive modules that are all shaped through natural selection to solve specific adaptation problems that confronted distant hominin relatives. So there are ethical considerations that do prevent us from doing direct experiments in humans to test the hypothesis, so we have to look back on the past to really figure out and put these two things together. So they move on to saying that sexual selection probably shaped behaviors like vocalization, territoriality, and courtship, and a lot of others. So they ask some big questions after this, like the first being, why is there a difference in sexual reproductive strategies in male and females? The first being that time investment, energy, and resources needed for female reproduction are very high. Whereas for men, it's low cost, and the most effective way to do this is to ensure bloodline. It's the most effective way to ensure a long and lasting bloodline for males. They move on to the ideal hip-to-waist ratio for females and talk about how it's the same across most cultures because evolutionarily, it represents the maximum fertility. There's also a difference in attraction. So women are attracted to power while men are attracted to youth because each of those has an evolutionary advantage for the offspring. Women are attracted to power because it allows for resources for their offspring, where men are attracted to youth because that is the most fertile time women are, so it gives them the maximum chance of having offspring. They then move on to our ability for language, which is very important for development of community and society. So it says that our memories of symbols and grammar of language are domain-specific and are evolved mechanisms that cannot be easily pressed into service for other domains. So that means that we have a strengthened intrinsic language ability that can't really be overridden by other things. So the next thing we move on to is evolution continues today. So evolution today usually comes through artificial selection, which is a rapid selection, or evolution driven by human behavior, and this usually happens over years or decades. There's a few examples of this, the first being that bacteria and antibiotic medicine, which can end up producing antibiotic-resistant bacteria. Another was that hunting of mountain rams that had the 360-degree curled horns was a big sporting expedition. So these became overhunted, and these rams began growing horns that didn't completely get to 360 degrees. So over the course of 30 years, the average horn size dropped by almost 25%. The last example was that there was an influx of large ground finches that entered the Galapagos Island community and caused an increase in competition for seed birds. So these large ground finches had large beaks and were able to eat these large seeds, while the larger beaked medium finches were unable to eat the seeds as easily. So the large beaked medium finches also were unable to eat the small seeds as easily as the smaller beaked finches. So these medium finches with large beaks died off, while the smaller beaked finches survived. This can even be brought into a human aspect to see fast progress of evolution. So what they theorize is that the difference between Asian, African, and European humans occurred in over less than 50,000 years in response to climate conditions, which in terms of evolution is very fast. So now we move into our last section, which is the cutting edge, which is our humans still evolving. So scientists now determine if a gene has been under strong natural selective stress by looking at genes in their neighboring DNA, which are known as a person's haplotype. There can be minor variations where one nucleotide substitutes for another at a certain location with a gene called an SNP. SNP is a single nucleotide polymorphism, and it's a minor variation within a gene or neighboring non-coding DNA where one nucleotide has been substituted for another. Most people have two of these versions, and they're called alleles. Alleles are just one or two of the different forms of gene or genetic locus. So these alleles cause variations within traits such as eye color variants, susceptibility to disease, levels of enzyme, and many other traits within the human body. So genes that have been shown to be subject to recent natural selection will show reduced variances in adjacent SNPs. And what will happen is as this gene spreads to the population, it'll just continue until a majority of the population is carrying that gene. And that is the end of Chapter 6, Segment 4.